Hello, everyone. Sorry, my room is kind of dark and you might not be able to see me really well, but I hope you can get the message. So, this video basically is in response to Module 8 discussion. We're supposed to be comparing the two countries that we've been following over the course. Now, the last time I did Kenya and Brazil, I've been able to get Brazil scores for all different cultural dimension values. But the country that I live in is Uganda, and it's kind of hard getting data for Uganda. So since Uganda is in sub-Saharan Africa, I'm just going to replace it with Zimbabwe because Uganda and Zimbabwe have kind of like the same. They're in the same sort of regional. Although Uganda is in East Africa, Zimbabwe is in mostly Southern Africa, but still considered sub-Saharan Africa. So the first question, the first prompt was asking us to generate graphs for CLT and global scores, which I did. If you check in the module A discussion upload, if you go through the Word document, you're going to see the graphs that were generated. Now I'm going to talk about the 10 insights. Just forgive me, I have to turn some pages. So performance orientation. This is described as collective rewarding and encouragement of group members to improve their performance. Now, Zimbabwe scored medium to relatively high in its practice, which is as because when you're dealing with the globe dimensions, you have the practice and then you have the value. Now, the difference between the practice and the value is the practice is what actually happens in the country, and the value is what the country aspires to. So the practice scores are, and the value scores should. So for performance orientation, Zimbabwe, a medium for their practice, and then for their values, they strive to be very high. And then when you look at Brazil, for their performance orientation, they have a relatively low practice score, and they ascertain to have a high value score, that is the should be. The second insight I want to talk about is assertive. Assertiveness is described as basically being assertive, rotational, and aggressive. I mean, the aggressiveness of individuals um, in relationships. It can be you and your boss, basically any kind of relationship. So the assertiveness index or the assertiveness cultural dimension measure how assertive is an individual context or dimension. I mean, in a certain context or cultural setting. So when you look at Zimbabwe has a score that is relatively low, and they strive to be relatively low. Basically, deals with their practice. So it has a low assertiveness score but when it comes to the values, what they are ascertained to be or what the country wants to be, they want to have a relatively high assertiveness score. When you look at Brazil, Brazil scores medium on their assertiveness index, and they aspire to be relatively low. So Brazil doesn't want to be an assertive country. The next insight I want to talk about is future orientation. Future orientation is the degree to which individuals engage in future-oriented behaviors, such as delaying gratification, planning, and investing in the future. So basically, a country that scores high on future orientation likes to plan ahead, and they don't really take things as they should be. They basically are able to adapt and change according to the situation. So when it comes to future orientation scores for Zimbabwe, Zimbabwe has a relatively low to medium future orientation, but I would say relatively low when it comes to their practice. But when it comes to their value, they want to have a high score for their future orientation. And then when you look at Brazil, Brazil has a future orientation practice that's relatively low, but they ascertain to have a value that's relatively high. So future orientation is very good when a country is trying to plan ahead and trying to make programs and aspirations that are going to help the citizens for a long term. So if a country maybe wants to plan to lay out ICT infrastructure so that every citizen in every corner of the country can have access to ICT services, it makes life not only easier, but it also makes it much, much more efficient for government to have service delivery. So this is an example of a what you call a future, a long-term future plan. So future orientation has it's kind of related to long-term orientation when it comes to looking at the scores, the dimensions from Hofstede. So a country that scores high in future orientation likes to implement projects that are long-term and is willing to be adaptive and flexible. The next insight that I want to talk about is humane orientation. Humane orientation is a degree to which a collective encourages and rewards individuals for being fair, altruistic, generous, caring, and kind to other people. So Zimbabwe has a human orientation score in its practices as medium, and it ascertains to have a relatively high um, score for their human orientation. When you look at Brazil, their human orientation practice is relatively low, and they ascertain to have a relatively high um, future orientation score. The next insight I want to look at is in group collectivism. In group collectivism is described as a degree to which individuals express pride, loyalty, and cohesiveness in an organization or family or community. Now, Zimbabwe has a relatively high score for their in group collectivism. And it's not surprising because Zimbabwe is classified as sort of like a collectivist country. Both Zimbabwe and Brazil have very high scores in their in group collectivism, in their practice values, and also in their values. I beg your pardon. Please excuse me for that. Zimbabwe and Brazil have relatively high scores in their practice side of score. And then again, in their values, they still are ascertained to be high when it comes to in-group collectivism. They want to have a high score when it comes to in-group collectivism because both these countries come from a collectivist mindset. Not very much for Zimbabwe, but much more so for Brazil. And then gender egalitarianism. Gender egalitarianism is basically the degree to which a collective minimizes gender inequality. So, trying to have a balance between males and females. A country that is considered gender egalitarian is a country that balances out the power relationship between men and women. So, Zimbabwe has a relatively low practice score for gender egalitarianism, and it ascertains to have a relatively high value score, while Brazil has relatively low practice score, but ascertains to have a medium um, value score. So Brazil, just compared to Zimbabwe, Zimbabwe wants to have better relations between the genders, but not so much for Brazil. It's like they're contented with the status quo between the relationships between males and females. The next thing I want to talk about is power distance. Power distance is the extent to which the community accepts and endorses authority, power differences, and status privileges. So Zimbabwe, has a very high power distance score when it comes to its practices, but ascertains to have a low value when it comes to practices. To values. That's the should be score. And then when you look at Brazil, Brazil has a relatively high power distance, just like Zimbabwe, and they want to reduce it in their values slash should be score. They want to have a low power distance so that people in different classes and hierarchies can be able to communicate and share ideas without having to feel the need for um, spacing out the power differences. That's basically how I best understand it. And then the last insight is uncertainty avoidance. This is a dimension that deals with, uncertainty avoidance is described as relying on social norms and rules and procedures to alleviate the unpredictable manner of future events. So, uncertainty avoidance basically, when you're dealing with uncertainty avoidance, you want to deal with the issue of unpredictability. So, most countries that score high on the uncertainty avoidance dimension want to eliminate unpredictable events. Zimbabwe has a medium score for uncertainty avoidance when it comes to its practices, but it ascertains to have a relatively high value score when it comes to the values. So Zimbabwe wants to have a high uncertainty avoidance so they can be able to carve out the issue of unpredictability. And then when you look at Brazil, Brazil has a relatively low uncertainty avoidance score, and when it comes to its practices. But when you go to values, that's the should be score. Brazil ascertains to have a relatively high uncertainty avoidance score. Now, all this comes from the globe dimensions. Now, I want to compare that to the Javidan et al. I don't know if that's the way you pronounce it. This comes from the Cultural Leadership and Organizations, the Globe Study of 62 societies. Now, I'm going to give the exact figure amounts for each of the 9 dimensions, both for their practices and for their values. Zimbabwe, performance orientation. For their practice score, they have a 4.24. And for their values, that is what they want to be or what they should be, is 6.45. And then when you look at Brazil, in performance orientation, their practice score is 4.04. That is, 4.04. And then what they ascertain, the value score, they want to have a value score of 6.13. So Zimbabwe wants to have a much higher value in their performance orientation than Brazil, basically. Although they're basically, they're kind of like in the same bracket, because when you look at 6.45 and 6.13, okay, the difference is about 0.3 something. It's about 0.2, let me see, 0.21? Well, 0.31 is the difference, so there's not much of a difference. The second dimension is future orientation. The exact score for practices is 3.77, and for values is 6.07 for Zimbabwe. And then for Brazil, the practice score is 3.81, and the value score is 5.69. When you look at assertiveness scores, the exact score for Zimbabwe in assertiveness is 4.06. That's the practice score, and the values, what they ascertain to be or should be, is 4.60. When you look at assertiveness in Brazil, their practice score is 4.20 and their value score is 2.91. Then we go to gender egalitarianism. The practice score for Zimbabwe is 3.04 and the value score is 4.46. When you look at gender egalitarianism in Brazil, it's 3.31 for practice and 4.99 for values. The next dimension is in-group collectivism. The exact score for practices for Zimbabwe is 4.12, and their values, or should be, is 4.87. So Zimbabwe wants to have a much higher score when it comes to their I'm sorry about that. This is institutional collectivism, yeah. So Zimbabwe has a practice score of 4.12, and a value score of 4.87. So Zimbabwe wants to strive to be more on the institutional collectivism score, how well a country shares its resources amongst the people. And then when you look at Brazil, their practice score is 3.84, and their value score is 5.62 for institutional collectivism. The next dimension is in group collectivism. In group collectivism for both Brazil and Zimbabwe is pretty high, like I said a couple of minutes ago. Now, the practice score for Zimbabwe is 5.57, and the one for the value is 5.85. And then the practice score for in group collectivism in Brazil is 5.18, and the value score is 5.15. When you look at power distance, that's the society's acceptability of the differences in power between different individuals and how comfortable they are with the power differences. Zimbabwe, just like Brazil, has relatively high power distance. Zimbabwe has a practice power distance score of 5.67 and their value of 2.67. So they want to have a lower power distance in their society. And then same thing with Brazil. Brazil has a practice power distance score of 5.33 and they ascertain to have a value score of 2.35. So they want to have a lower power distance, just like any other country that has a high power distance scores. And then humane orientation is the next dimension. Zimbabwe has a practice score of 4.45 and a value score of 5.19. And then Brazil has a practice humane orientation score of 3.66, and they want to have values that should be score of 5.68. So both Brazil and Zimbabwe want to have better scores at their humane orientation. That is, humane orientation is basically the degree to which a collective encourages and rewards individuals for being altruistic, generous, caring, and kind. So, how kind does your society want to be? And I think most societies want to have a high score for humane orientation because it's believed that the human is the most valuable asset. Without a human being, without mankind, you cannot have anything done. All the inventions that we have, all the discoveries that have been made by human beings. So without human beings, you cannot really have innovation. And then the last one I want to talk about is uncertainty avoidance. The practice score for Zimbabwe is 4.15, and the value score for Zimbabwe is 4.73. And then for Brazil, the practice score is 3.60, and the value score is 4.99. So all these come out of the Cultural Leadership and Organizations article by Javidan et al., the 2006. So the next is some of the interesting facts that I got from the CLT and Globe study. Now, the major difference between Brazil and Zimbabwe is seen with humane orientation, uncertainty avoidance, and performance orientation. Zimbabwe has much higher scores in these three dimensions than Brazil. And then both countries, that is Brazil and Zimbabwe, score relatively equally on gender egalitarianism, in-group collectivism, with relatively high scores, especially for the in-group collectivism, since they're both countries are basically collectivist cultures. I'm sorry for all the clicking. My phone kind of reduces its light transmission, so I have to click the screen so the light can be I can have a balanced light approach. I don't really have a very up-to-date smartphone, so I'm sorry for all the clicking. And then CLT scores. Both countries have a high need for charismatic and team-oriented leadership, as these societies fall into the collectivist side of culture, where in-group collectivism and loyalty to groups is rewarded with a promise for security. So in most of these cultures that have high collectivist scores, most people like to identify with a certain group, maybe your tribe, your religion, your clan, or maybe your football team or something. So in that group, you agree that you're going to give up some of your individuality for protection from maybe some of the elders in the group. That's just how some countries do their thing. And then biblical insights. Well, the first one I got was Colossians 3:11, which basically is trying to explain the oneness in Christ. The second verse I got was Acts chapter 17, verse 26 to 28, and then 1 Corinthians 9:20. We're all free in Christ, no matter our differences, whether you're a Jew, whether you're a Gentile, whether you're Greek, doesn't matter what you are, we're all one in Christ. So these Bible verses try to explain this. And the one that I really liked was Acts chapter 17, verse 26 to 28, where it talks about God placing human beings in different corners of the globe and having their boundaries and borders set. But even with all the differences that we have, we still have to strive to be more like Christ. And this is what Paul was trying to tell us in most of these acts, most of the letters that I wrote in the New Testament, in Colossians 3:11, Acts chapter 17, 26 to 28, and 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 20. But my favorite verse in all of this was 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 20, and then Colossians 3:11. And then, okay, for my culture, my CQS post-test. So the CQS post-test, I increased my values from the pre-test in nonverbal communication, pausing and silencing differently to fit the situation, and rules for expressing nonverbal behaviors. And then my CQ strategy and CQ knowledge have greatly improved, but I have to work on my CQ drive and my CQ strategy. So I scored for strategy and knowledge of grown up, but my CQ drive is still a little bit on the low side, and I have to improve on that. So that's this, and yeah, I hope we can all understand.